これで大丈夫。またやり直す。All right. Hello and welcome everyone to episode 16 of Japan. Hello and welcome everyone to episode 16 of Japan Foundation New York's Pop Culture Series. Thank you all for tuning into our episode today, focusing on the topic of yokai and J-horror. We'll also be taking a look at how these monsters and spirits have heavily influenced the J-horror genre while adapting and staying relevant in this modern digital age. For today's session, we have invited the following esteemed guests who will be providing us with their expertise and presentations. Our first guest is Dr. Michael Dillon Foster, Professor of Japanese at the University of California, Davis, where he teaches courses on Japanese folklore, heritage, tourism, and popular culture. He's the author of the Book of Yōkai, Mysterious Creatures of Japanese Folklore, and Pandemonium and Parade, Japanese Monsters and the Culture of Yōkai, and numerous articles on Japanese folklore, literature, and media. Our second guest is Dr. Lindsay Nelson, Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science and Economics at Meiji University. Her work has appeared in Journal of Japanese and Korean Cinema, East Asian Journal of Popular Culture, and Japanese Studies. Her first book, Circulating Fear, Japanese Horror, Fractured Realities, and New Media, was published by Lexington Books in 2021. Our third guest is Dr. Michael Crandall, Assistant Professor of Modern Japanese Studies at Leiden University in the Netherlands, where he teaches courses on film, anime, and the supernatural in Japanese literature. He's the author of Ghost in the Well, The Hidden History of Horror Films in Japan, available from Bloomsbury Publishing. Today, we'll begin our program with a pre-recorded presentation from each guest speaker. Dr. Foster will start us off with the history and the origins of yokai. Following Dr. Foster's presentation, Dr. Crandall will talk about the specific type of yokai, the Onryo, and walk us through its origins, and also touch upon how the Onryo became such a globally recognizable horror icon. Dr. Nelson will then close out our presentations with her segment, focusing on a very popular and globally recognizable Onryo, Sadako, or Samara, as American audiences might remember her by. Dr. Nelson will showcase how Sadako has evolved over the years and adapted to our new digital age. After their presentations, we'll then return and start the discussion moderated by Dr. Foster. He'll be leading our discussion and answering questions we've received from our registrants. And while we already have received a number of great questions already, we will be choosing and answering a few of the live chat questions at the end, so please feel free to ask them in the YouTube live chat during the stream. Also, a quick reminder to please keep the chat clean and friendly. And with that, let's get right into the presentations, and I'll see you all later during the Q&A session. Please enjoy.
Hello, everybody. My name is Michael Dillon Foster, and I'm a professor at the University of California, Davis. Today, it's my honor to give the first presentation in our event today. And what I'd like to talk about is yokai, and yokai as kind of the basis out of which Japanese horror film and Japanese horror culture emerged. You've probably heard the word yokai, which is why you're here at this talk. You've heard of this word. And I've actually been studying yokai now for over 20 years in one way or another. And this is a shameless plug for my own books. But if you want to take a much, much deeper dive into the subject, please do take a look at one or both of these books. The key question to start with, though, is what are yokai? This is actually a lot harder to answer than one would think, but essentially they are often translated as into English as monster, sometimes translated as simply supernatural creature, sometimes as spirit, sometimes as mysterious phenomenon. And I think what's important about this is that yokai is a broad term which can encapsulate everything from a monster, from the physical body of a dangerous, frightening monster, to something like a mysterious phenomenon, a tree falling in the woods for no reason, or the sound of something rattling in your house, a poltergeist phenomenon, can also encompass in its modern meaning ghosts and spirits of all sorts. So it's a kind of vague catch-all phrase. And in fact, there have been many other words to describe these things in Japanese historically. One that you might have heard of from Princess Mononoke, the Studio Ghibli film, is Mononoke. Another one which is quite common even today is bakemono or obake. These are really forms of the same word. Obake is a little more childish, but it really means a changing thing, which reflects the shape-shifting quality of many of these frightening yokai. Another word that you might come across is yurei, and yurei is probably most strictly speaking translated as ghost. In some ways, that category can also be seen under the broader rubric of yokai, though other people would dispute that and say it's a separate kind of thing. But yurei is something that's part of a lot of these older stories in which frightening things occurred. Where do yokai come from? And this is just a kind of basic cognitive thing, I think, but it's really a very rational process, right? Something strange happens, some event, some phenomenon. You get a weird, scary, creepy feeling, a question, how can that be? And you try to label it somehow. You try to identify it. You try to create an image or an object to associate with it. And in a sense, that's the emergence of yokai, at least on an individual level. Here's an example. Late at night, you're walking through the mountains in Japan 100 years ago, let's say, and it's starting to rain, and you see an old abandoned house. So you crawl inside, lie down, and go to sleep. But in the middle of the night, you have a sense that something is watching you, an eerie, creepy feeling. And this is an illustration of that feeling. You can see the eyes embedded in these old shoji screens. And then you can label this, call it something. In fact, this is a yokai that's called mokumoku-den, literally eyes continuously, or eyes everywhere. It's an object, an image, a name associated with that creepy feeling of being watched. During the Heian period, an earlier period of Japanese history, one common phenomenon that we can read about is something called hyakiyagyo. This was the idea, literally translated here as a night procession of 100 demons, but it implied that a place and or a time that was infested by demons, and therefore it was very dangerous. It implied a frightening, chaotic mass of strange creatures. And key to this is that they were undifferentiated and unnamed, just kind of a mass of scary things. Here's one example from a 13th century collection of tales. This monk is traveling through the woods at night, and he comes across an abandoned temple, and he goes in there to sleep at night. And he wakes up in the middle of the night and sees a crowd, some 100 strong, surging into the temple. When they got close, he saw that they were fantastically weird creatures. There were all sorts of them, some with only one eye, some with horns, while their heads were more terrible than words can describe. And I've highlighted some of these words here because what I want to emphasize is the undifferentiated aspect of them and the variety that hyakiyagyo entailed. There's fear here, but at the same time, there's also fun. This is, after all, a story that's being told, and it's being told in part because it's entertaining. It thrills us. It gives us the chills. We want to know how this monk comes out, whether he survives or not. We also, when we have something like hyakiyagyo, we get a gradual process of visualization in which these amorphous creatures are identified individually and drawn, made into an image, just like we saw with that mokumoku-den before. In this process, horror can also be transmogrified into humor. Here is an old picture scroll, Hyakiyagyo picture scroll. And you can see here there's many, many strange creatures. There's a long-necked creature, a two-headed creature, and this whole morass of some object creatures, everyday objects that sprout arms and legs and become animated. And there's not much of a storyline here, but there's an objectification of these, making these yokai into objects that are visual and sometimes actually quite humorous. There's not much narrative here, except it does end with the sun rising and this hyakiyagyo, these many different creatures, presumably scattering with daylight. That was an idea, a set of scrolls that existed before the Edo period. The Edo period is a very important time in Japanese history for a lot of reasons, but one of them is because it was a time of great urbanization. There was a rise of literacy and a vibrant popular culture that gave birth to, for example, kabuki theater, also to puppet theater, to ukiyo-e woodblock prints, popular books of all sorts. And within this context, yokai also became differentiated. They became identified, they became characters. They became labeled, named, and individualized, as it were. Here's another example of a picture scroll. And you can see a lot of strange creatures are identified here. It's very similar to what we were just looking at, but there's one major difference, and that's each one of these yokai is labeled. The black writing above the yokai is what it is called. And this one is called a hyosube. And you can see also it's a little bit comical, although it might be quite frightening if you were to bump into that in the middle of the night in a dark alley or in the woods somewhere. But my point here is that they are becoming identified, and they are becoming, as it were, characters that can be transferred into all sorts of different stories. So what do we do with yokai? What did people do with yokai during the Edo period? There's this huge variety of them. And one of the things that people did was they collected them. That is, they collected this kind and that kind, and they classified them, they organized them, they described them. This is what I've called the encyclopedic mode. They dealt with them like you would in an encyclopedia. We do that today with, for example, Pokemon, right? Where you collect them and keep them in your Pokedex, right? Another way of interacting them was maybe not quite as serious, but similar in some ways, and that's that you tell stories about them. You draw them, as we've seen here. You play with them. You create new ones. This is what I've called the ludic mode. It's an entertaining and creative process of expressing information. So both of these are symbiotic and related ways of dealing with this great mass of supernatural creatures and beliefs and folktales and legends that exist. Here's an example of the encyclopedic mode. This is literally an encyclopedia. It's called the Wakan Sansai Zue. It's from 1713. And in this encyclopedia of all sorts of things, there's various sections that deal with these creatures that we might call yokai. Oh, they're not called yokai specifically in the encyclopedia, but you can see all these weird and otherwise inexplicable creatures are described here with an image and a description, often of their habits and habitats and where you might find them. The one on the left, for example, is something called a kawataro. You might have heard of kappa, which is a very common water creature found in legends throughout Japan. Here's the way the Wakan Sansai Zue describes it as about the size of a 10-year-old child, emerges from the water, and one of the things that it likes to do is pull cattle and horses into the water and suck blood from their rumps, so people crossing rivers must be very careful. But the point here is that we get a picture and we get a description of its habits and its habitat in a very encyclopedic fashion. Then we get the ludic mode. Again, people telling stories, drawing, creating. This appears during the Edo period and even now in all sorts of different media. And this is where, in particular, things can be both fun and fearful, just like contemporary horror films and horror culture and popular culture today. Here's an example of a genre of illustrated book called the Kibyoshi, which were very popular, very parodic and humorous and sophisticated. But we get images of yokai here in various situations. Here's one on the left. There's a kappa in the water, and then a one-eyed god, one-eyed demon of sorts in the middle, and then a four-eyed demon, as it were, where they're sort of making fun of contemporary technology of spectacles. We also, during the Edo period, one of the most famous and important people with regard to yokai was Toriyama Sekien. He was an artist and a yokai compiler who created a series of encyclopedias, compendia of yokai. And here's just some of his images, and you can see how they're like encyclopedias. But at the same time, what's really fascinating is he was also having fun. It was encyclopedic and ludic at the same time. There's the Hyosube there on the left. And here is the Mokumoku-ren that we saw earlier. And if we read the description, we realize he's actually making a joke, because he says this is a house that has many eyes. It must be the house of somebody who played the game of Go. In the game of Go, a certain formation is called a me, which is the same word in Japanese as the word for eye. So he's making a pun, a play on words. It's not very funny to us today, but we can see that he's not just giving us an expression of a feeling, an encyclopedic categorization of a documentation of a yokai, but also making a joke about it and having fun. Another way that people dealt with scary stories was by scaring themselves, as it were, just like we do again with horror films and horror culture today. There was something called hyakumonogatari or hyakumonogatari kaidankai, which were scary storytelling sessions. Literally means 100 stories. What would happen is people would gather at night, often maybe in an old temple or somewhere potentially frightening, and they would tell a tale, and after each tale, they would extinguish a light. So after many, many tales, they would extinguish the last light, the place would be thrown into darkness, and then something really, really scary, a yokai, was supposed to emerge. Another interesting narrative that was very well known during this time was Inomono no Keiroku, which was a set of legends, picture scrolls about an event that happened in the month of July 1749. In a sense, it's what we might think of as an urban legend or a contemporary legend today, and a whole bunch of narratives accrued around it. It's the idea, it took place in Miyoshi in current-day Hiroshima, and the story told of a specific 16-year-old samurai, Ino Heitaro, who was visited in his home every night by a different yokai, every night for a month, and how he transcended the fear of them. So you can imagine that this would make a great horror film today, and it certainly was fun for people in those days to depict in various different media. As I said, there were different picture scrolls and images of it, and here's just a few examples. Finally, I would be amiss if I didn't talk just very briefly about Tokaido Yotsuya Kaidan, which was perhaps the quintessentially famous kabuki horror story, which is a ghost story that I think my colleagues will be talking a little bit more about, and we can certainly discuss later as well. But we can see in this ghost story the image of a vengeful ghost of a woman who was wronged, and how not only the kabuki theater aspect of it was important, but the multimedia aspect. It was re-articulated in woodblock prints and for many, many years. So just to conclude, from the Edo period to the present, I think we can see encyclopedic and ludic modes symbiotically coming together, the idea of identifying scary phenomena. We also see them expressed in a wide variety of media. And this continues today. The yokai themselves may not appear, although often they do, but certainly they provide the foundation for contemporary films and other popular cultures that draw on these older forms, express them in different media, and are always reflecting the concerns of the particular moment. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen, and I will hand the camera over to my colleagues, and I look forward to having a discussion about all of this with all of you later in the event. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Michael Crandall, and I'm an assistant professor of modern Japan studies at Leiden University in the Netherlands. And I'm very happy to be here today to join Michael and Lindsay in talking about yokai, which are one of my very favorite subjects. I'll get started. One of the most recognizable yokai today is the Onryo, or vengeful ghost, who's been haunting the global stage for the past quarter century or so in the guise of Sadako, Kayako, and the innumerable other ghosts of J-horror, Japan's internationally popular horror media. Nowadays, the J-horror Onryo, with her long black hair and tattered white robe, obscured facial features, and penchant for crawling about on the floor in unnervingly inhuman fashion, has long been something of an overexposed horror movie cliche. All the way back in 2011, Scream 4 opened with two characters complaining about the tired tropes of recent horror flicks, including, quote, aliens, zombies, and little Asian ghost girls. A put down to be sure, but also a testament to the extent which the Onryo had successfully integrated itself into worldwide popular culture. When J-horror films like The Ring and Ju-on the Grudge first appeared around the turn of the millennium, Sadako and Kayako were seen as reinvigorating the global horror genre with something uniquely and freshly terrifying. But where did she come from, and what made her so scary for audiences, not just in Japan, but the rest of the world? Today, I will talk briefly about the origins of the J-horror Onryo in pre-modern Japanese traditions, the mixture of truth and legend that gave rise to her, and how modern Japanese filmmakers and later Hollywood transformed her into a global horror icon. We will look at the role Buddhist conceptions of shunin and karma play in governing the actions of traditional Onryo, and how the removal of this framework allowed the J-horror creators to reimagine her along the lines of what has been identified as paranoid horror, the dominant mode of horror films of the past half century. Now, the concept of the Onryo was well established in Japan over 1,000 years ago, in sources both overtly fictional and historically factual. The belief that extreme feelings of anger or desire could cause a vengeful spirit to pose a mortal threat to the living was widespread by the Heian era and informs key moments in the famous 11th century novel, The Tale of Genji, such as the scene when the ghost of Lady Rokujo, one of the title character's spurned lovers, kills her rival Murasaki. Genji is, of course, a work of fiction, but the vengeful ghost of the very real 9th century poet and court official Sugawara no Michizane, who died while exiled from the capital by his political opponents, was blamed for a series of disasters which struck Kyoto after his death that resulted in the demise of more than a few of his enemies. Both Lady Rokujo and Michizane's Onryo forms are heavily informed by Buddhist notions of karma. The concept of shunin, or a fierce emotional attachment, plays a key role in the Onryo's creation. This is the belief that strong emotions such as anger or desire for revenge prevent the soul from reincarnating after death, binding it in the form of a vengeful ghost that cannot move on until it is appeased, either through the interventional prayers of a monk, or else by exacting its revenge on the targets of its wrath. In traditional tales, these targets are often unsavory villains frequently responsible for the death of the Onryo, and thus they're kind of deserving of what they get. The Onryo in this case becomes a sort of agent of karmic retribution, dealing out cosmological justice in the form of their grisly hauntings. And Rokujo and Michizane established much of this pattern, but the most important ancestor of the J-horror Onryo can be found in a single tale from the much later Edo period, the 1825 kabuki play Yotsuya Kaidan, or The Ghost Story of Yotsuya, which tells the tale of Tamiya Oewa, a woman poisoned and left for dead by her heartless samurai husband. Oewa's vengeful ghost returns to haunt her husband Iemon and everyone else responsible in the conspiracy against her, bringing about their deaths in gruesome fashion and swearing to bring an end to the blood of the Tamiya family line. Like Rokujo and Michizane, Oewa's vendetta is heavily rooted in Buddhist notions of shunin and karmic retribution. And once Oewa's husband falls dead in the final moments of the play, her soul is exhorted to, quote, find rebirth in Buddha's paradise, and presumably ceases to haunt the realm of the living. And like all the best ghost stories, there's just enough tantalizing evidence that Oewa's tale might be based in fact. Several still extant shrines to Oiwa's spirit remain in Tokyo to this day, and Tamiya family records indicate that the original line may have indeed died out in the early 1700s, around the time the events of Yotsuya Kaidan are supposed to have taken place. As to whether or not Oiwa's spirit really found peace once her vendetta was complete, a well-known superstition states that she has since transferred her curse to the play itself, resulting in several onstage accidents, deaths, and other weird phenomena. To this day, whenever Yotsuya Kaidan is performed for stage, screen, or television, the actors must visit her shrine beforehand to avoid catastrophe. Now, how much of Oiwa's tale really happened is debatable, but its surviving legacy in J-horror is undeniable. Ring's Sadako and Juon's Kayako, the two most famous J-horror Onryo, are both betrayed and murdered by immediate male family members, the father in the case of Sadako, and the husband in the case of Kayako, making Kayako's origin story especially parallel to Oiwa's. Sadako's and Kayako's intense anger and despair at this familial betrayal gives rise to a revenge-based curse in much the same manner seen in Yotsuya Kaidan almost 2 centuries earlier. Furthermore, the visual template for Sadako, the first J-horror Onryo, directly derives from the stage notes of the Edo period kabuki play. Oiwa is described as having long disheveled hair and dressed all in white, which is typical imagery for a Japanese ghost, but more curiously distinct features were also incorporated into Sadako's look, including Oiwa's disfigured face. Now, we don't see much of Sadako's face in the original Ring film, but the single partial glimpse we do get reveals an unnaturally deformed eye, quite similar to the traditional stage makeup for Oiwa. Most gruesome of all is the stage note that describes Oiwa's bloody, torn-out fingernails, which we can clearly see on Sadako as well in the climax of the first Ring film. The Sadako, Kayako, and their ilk have Oiwa's looks and her motivations, but what they don't have are the cosmological laws of Buddhism holding them in check. Unlike earlier Onryo, their rage is unfocused. It's not directed solely against the people who did them harm. It's turned upon the world at large. They haunt not deserving victims of karmic retribution, but all of us. And because of this, they are unstoppable, since there is no way to appease their out-of-control anger. This is largely what made J-horror so innovatively terrifying for Japanese audiences, unleashing the traditional ghosts of the past and the modern world in a way that meant no one was safe. This brought the Onryo in line with contemporary theories of horror film and helped pave the way for her global success. J-horror is a perfect example of what film genre theorist Andrew Tudor has called paranoid horror, which he identifies as the dominant mode of horror film for the past half-century. And paranoid horror supposes a thoroughly unreliable and untrustworthy world where traditional rules and systems that were meant to protect us from ghosts and monsters fail and no longer apply. Now, J-horror also worked well internationally because the idea of angry spirits returning from the grave to seek revenge is not a uniquely Japanese or East Asian concept. The Victorian ghost stories of M.R. James or Susan Hill's 1983 novel, The Woman in Black, attest to the universality of this trope. Nonetheless, when Hollywood produced the inevitable remakes of J-horror, steps were taken to adapt the material for Western audiences. And we can see 2 different strategies of adaptation at work in the remakes of the 2 flagship franchises of J-horror, The Ring and The Grudge. For The Ring, the choice was made to transpose the story to America, reimagining the characters as American, and while the plot really remains largely identical to the Japanese original, American horror movie tropes inevitably reshape the material to a degree. Sadako notably becomes Samara, who is no longer a 6-foot-tall young adult woman with a face mostly hidden by tangles of hair, but a demonic child figure who bears more than a passing resemblance to Regan from The Exorcist. Samara is also much more of a bad seed type monster from the very beginning, malevolent in her intent even before she's murdered and turned into a ghost. bringing her more in line with Hollywood's own traditions of evil children like Regan or The Omen's Damien. Now, The Grudge, meanwhile, keeps the Japanese settings and monsters of Ju-on intact, down to casting the same actress to play Kayako in both versions. The protagonists become American expats living in Japan, and the difficulties of navigating daily life in an unfamiliar language and culture adds an additional layer of unnerving tension to the horror. Ju-on's original creator, Shimizu Takashi, directed his own remake for Hollywood, which certainly accounts for this innovative approach. And it must be said, while bringing American characters to the Japanese setting brilliantly adds to the sense of paranoid horror, it also turns Japan itself into something of a monstrous other, a strange alien land. And just like the West ghosts, goblins, and demonic children, yokai are really about all of us. Monsters reveal our fears, anxieties, and sometimes even our darkest desires. If the J-horror Onryo did so well globally, it's because she has something to say to everyone, no matter where they're from, whether it's about the dangers that unchecked feelings of anger and vengeance pose to our own souls, or the monsters they might unwittingly release on the world.
Hello, my name is Lindsay Nelson. I am an associate professor at Meiji University, and my research focuses on Japanese horror films and Japanese popular culture. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about yokai and yurei, and specifically Sadako, perhaps one of the most famous yurei, and how she has adapted in the internet age. So let me just share my slides with you here. So again, the title of my talk today is Sadako and Yurei in the Digital Age. And here I have an image from the original Ring film where we can see, of course, Sadako crawling out of a television screen. And then on the other side is an image of the poster for the not yet released, as of this filming, it's going to be released in September 2022, Sadako DX, the latest film in the Ring and Sadako franchise, where you can see that the main character is holding a smartphone. So perhaps things have changed a little bit for Sadako and how she transmits her curse. So I just wanted to talk first a little bit about terminology and two words that are kind of important in this discussion, yurei and onryo. A yurei generally refers to any kind of ghost or spirit, while an onryo is specifically a vengeful spirit, an embodiment of rage related to a past wrongdoing. And some people use these words interchangeably, but I think that yurei is kind of a more generic term, whereas onryo is a little more specific. And I would definitely classify Sadako as an onryo. She is an embodiment of rage, and she flings that rage outward and doesn't really care who it hits. But at the same time, of course, she is also a spirit. She is a yurei. So the original Sadako, of course, appeared in the 1998 film Ring. The Ring, Ringu, has appeared in many of its sequels, adjacent films, and remakes. I picked this little clip here just because I wanted to illustrate Sadako's kind of signature awkward movement. And this was achieved via a very practical effect of simply filming the actress and then playing the footage backward. So if you watch the entire scene, you might notice that this kind of awkward shoulder movement is basically just accomplished through backward broadcast, backward filming. And it kind of adds, I think, to Sadako's sort of uncanny and otherworldly feel. And so if we think about Sadako and yokai and yurei in the age of internet and social media, you might remember, of course, that the original Sadako spread her curse through a video cassette and a TV screen. But now, how might yurei spread their vengeance or their curses in 2022 in the age of social media? And needless to say, the methods are different, as we can see yet another image here from the upcoming Sadako DX film, where, as far as I can tell, though I haven't seen the film yet, everything seems to center around smartphones and uploading cursed video images online. And this leads, I think, to a larger question about the changing nature of how urban legends, including stories of ghosts and yokai, are spread. Of course, in the past, these stories might have been spread through newspapers or word of mouth. But today it happens, of course, mostly online. And I think a famous example of this is the urban legend of Kune Kune, which sort of translates to twisty twisty, and is a story about young boys in the countryside who see a kind of white figure in a field, and it sort of drives them mad. And Kune Kune famously was born on the internet. It ostensibly began in the 4chan message boards, and then was further disseminated on 4chan and in the larger internet. So that's possibly the first example of an urban legend being born on the internet, not just spreading there. So both the nature of how these stories come to be and how they spread has changed a lot. And not only that, but I think the role of the internet and new media technologies in Japanese horror films of the last decade, including many Ring sequels, has changed a lot, with computers and smartphones and social media starting to play a central role in these films. And a lot of movies of the past 10 or 15 years feature computers, smartphones, the internet as central components of the plot, or even characters who are YouTubers. And I think this maybe reflects the sort of classic dynamic where the older generation is kind of nervous about this YouTube stuff, and also about the fact that young Japanese are kind of enamored with the idea of YouTuber as a job, whereas young people see becoming a YouTuber as a great career option. And so when YouTubers pop up in these horror films, they don't usually meet a good end. But just a couple of interesting examples here from 2010, the short film Webkamera Tsuwa, or Webcam Call, which is part of the Ni Channeru no Noroi, the Ni Channel Curse series of films. And features, as you can see, a group of people telling ghost stories, but they're doing it via webcam. So they're, we can just see them in the computer instead of maybe around a campfire, which is why they might have done in the past. I'm sorry, I think I said 4chan earlier, but of course it's Nichan that Nichan. 4chan is the US equivalent. And Sadako 3D from 2012, which has a lot of focus on Nico Nico, which is kind of the Japanese version of YouTube, and also just live streaming, where Sadako's curse tends to move through YouTube and Nico Nico-like channels. And then Sadako from 2019, which features one character who's trying to become a YouTuber, a famous YouTuber, by uploading scary Sadako videos. So those are just a couple of examples. So getting into more detail with some of these examples, we have Sadako versus Kayako from 2016. And this film was a mashup kind of the Ring and Grudge franchises, so Ringu and Ju-on. And the beginning of this film featured two girls going to a junk shop to purchase a video cassette recorder, because of course those aren't really around anymore. And it's kind of been a joke for a while that any contemporary Ring sequel or remake is going to have to spend some time explaining to certain audience members what a VCR is or what a video cassette is, because they're just not really in use. So in Sadako versus Kayako, one girl has to explain to another what a video cassette is, and then later Sadako's cursed video is uploaded on the internet, not via video cassette. Then in the 2017 English language film Rings, we have, again, Sadako's curse being transmitted via the internet, sometimes via email. And interestingly, it seems to mutate in the sense that code changes, or, code is reshaped and remade by people who share it. Here you can see in this case that it does still seem to be shared via email and not via social media, but it just says urgent from unknown to Julia, watch me. The idea is that it's much easier, of course, to spread this curse through the internet. Then in 2019, we have this film, Sadako, which again, this one actually features a character who is trying to become a famous YouTuber, and he's trying to become famous by filming videos of himself going to scary places, including an apartment that Sadako was perhaps haunting. And I think the messaging in this film is pretty clear that being a YouTuber is bad or dangerous. It will end up getting you killed by a ghost or something. Let's see. And finally, again, the aforementioned Sadako DX, which is an upcoming September 22 film in the franchise, which again focuses on transmitting all of this stuff via smartphones and the internet. And another interesting detail for me with these sort of upgrades or updates to the Sadako story and character is that the timeline keeps getting shorter. If you know from the original films, when you watch the film, you would have 7 days before you would die. You'd get a little phone call and it would say 7 days. A voice would say that. But in Sadako versus Kayako, I think it was reduced to 3 days. And then in this new Sadako DX, apparently it's 24 hours. That also, I think, reflects perhaps young people and the general public's favoring of shorter and shorter video forms. The idea that you would wait 7 days or something would take 7 days just doesn't seem realistic in the current media landscape. Sadako has also popped up in recent years in comic books. As part of the promotional tie-in for the 2019 Sadako film, there was a comic book released called Sadako-san and Sadako-chan, so like Sadako and Little Sadako. And basically the whole idea of the comic was that adult Sadako is schooled by a young version of herself in how to be a YouTuber or how to use smartphones. In the little frame that I've chosen here, the older Sadako asks, "Why do you know about me?" And the younger Sadako says, "Oh, you're famous. You know, everybody knows about you through smartphones." And she shows her how to use a smartphone. Another comic book that came out around a similar time called Shumatsu no Sadako-san, or Sadako at the End of the World, kind of features Sadako as a sort of sweet caretaker to 2 young girls in a kind of post-apocalyptic landscape. She's frustrated, of course, because it's a post-apocalyptic landscape, so there's no people for her to curse. And the final frames of the comic basically show her climbing out of the frame of the comic book and saying to the reader, "Oh, there you are," as if now she's going to curse us, of course, the people who have been reading her comic book. One more interesting example is the Sadako's now has a YouTube channel. This happened just a couple of months ago, I think. And it seems to be part of a promotional tie-in for a new video game that's related to Sadako, and possibly also related to the movie release that's happening in September. It's called Sadako no Idogurashi, or Sadako's Life in the Well. Looks like she has a little over 120,000 subscribers, so not bad. And her videos are just kind of tongue-in-cheek and silly. Obviously an actress playing Sadako, and I think one of them has over 1 million views, which is pretty impressive. But I think it's also just an example of how anything frightening in Japan will probably at some point be cutified. And I think that's definitely true for Sadako, even though the movies that have been made about her in the last 20 years after the original Ring have not been comedies. They have been serious films. But on the internet, at least in terms of, memes and other kind of social media content, she tends to be sort of cutesy and sweet. So I think if we just look at the evolution of Sadako and other yurei and yokai in the digital age, I think it's just really an example of old stories but new screens. The stories that these newer movies are telling may be similar, but the manner of their dissemination does change over time, and that also affects the nature of the stories themselves. And I think that the Sadako films are still at their heart just ghost stories, but they're ghost stories now where the spirits travel via fiber optic cables and Wi-Fi instead of via whispers at a slumber party or audiences in a newspaper. And as technology, and particularly social media and communications technology, continue to change, it'll be interesting to see how Sadako and other yurei continue to adapt to the times. Right. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for watching. I hope you were able to get a sense of what was going on from that. I know we had a little problem with technology, and as I hope we gathered from the presentations, particularly Lindsay's presentation at the end, one of the things yokai love to haunt and mess around with is technology. So I suspect that there's a yokai in the mix today, so we are not alone. Anyway, let me get right to it. First of all, I want to thank the Japan Foundation New York for putting on this event, and Shun Inoue for organizing everything so beautifully, despite the yokai being around. And it's a great honor and pleasure for me to be joined here by two scholars of Japanese horror, Lindsay Nelson and Michael Crandall. My own interests and my own background really is in yokai, and for me it's very exciting to see how there are connections between the yokai of folklore and the horror films of the contemporary moment, and the horror video games and other ways in which these things are incorporated. What we're going to do is we're going to have a conversation now for the next 20 minutes or so. We've already received a lot of questions in the earlier registration period, so I'm going to start off with those questions for Lindsay and Michael, and we'll have a conversation. But please do, as you're listening, write your questions in the chat, and Shun will be able to ask us those questions later. So as you're listening, something comes up, and I saw a few good questions already in there that hopefully we'll get to, and hopefully we've already answered some of the questions that you had. But let me just begin with a question that's we've had from other people, and it seems to be kind of in the background, and that really is, how do we, and this is for either Lindsay or Mike, how do we define J-horror as opposed to other forms of horror? What makes Japanese horror distinct from Hollywood horror, from European style horror? Can you sum that up in a few words?
Maybe a few. We'll try. Yeah, I mean, when J-horror first kind of hit internationally in the early 2000s, I think what a lot of people in the West seized upon were the perceived differences. So horror films coming out of Hollywood in the second half of the 1990s were mainly slasher films like the Scream franchise, and there was a sense among Western fans of horror that this was kind of tired and been done. And then Ring came along and everybody said, oh, it's so fresh and different, and it's, unlike anything we've seen before. And so a lot of people kind of sought the essence of that in the fact that it was Japanese, it was Asian, it was not Western. So, there was this lot of discourse about how, what made it so scary was how inscrutable and, mysterious it was. And you can smell the Orientalism in the air. But I think that overlooks is the fact that if you talk to the filmmakers themselves, the people who are making these films, they can't say enough about the old Hollywood films they were watching. And there's an acknowledgement that this grows out of traditions like the Onryo and Yotsuya Kaidan, but stylistically, they were really taking a lot from Western horror films of the 1960s and 1970s. So I think what J-horror, it's perceived of as being quite different, but the reason it was so successful, I think, is because it's such a good hybrid of horror forms that are familiar to a global audience, but then get that kind of East Asian, Japanese spin on the material.
Lindsay, do you have anything to add to that in terms of popular culture and Sadako?
Yeah, that's great. I think the only thing I would add is that there's a bit of disagreement about whether J-horror just means a horror film made in Japan, or if it refers to a specific time period and specific group. And for me, I feel like whenever I hear J-horror, I tend to think of a very specific and very short time period, usually the late 1990s to the early 2000s, and a very specific and small group of directors, people like Shimizu Takashi, Nakata Hideo, Kurosawa Kiyoshi, people who made The Ring, The Grudge, Pulse, Cure. And these were movies by a similar group of people who all knew each other and who all watched each other's movies and wrote about each other's movies. They were also film scholars, and that shared a kind of similar aesthetic and similar themes. So, other people might say that, certain other films outside of that time period or by different directors also count as J-horror. That's fine. But I think for me, at least, J-horror tends to refer to this very specific period of films by this very specific group of directors that tend to share certain characters, plots, and aesthetics.
Actually, that brings me to another question I hadn't planned to ask, but with that in mind, it sounds like these directors were sort of drawing on each other and drawing also on Hollywood films and predecessors in the film industry. What was their relationship with more traditional folk narratives concerning yokai and yurei? What was the relationship with kabuki? Do we have any idea of that? I mean, obviously, as Mike pointed out, they were consciously drawing on Yotsuya Kaidan, right, for Sadako. So I wonder if you know of anything of how they were doing that and what the relationship was there.
Yeah, so the kind of intermediary figure here is a director from the late 1950s, early 1960s called Nakagawa Nobuo, and he made film versions of Yotsuya Kaidan and lots of other traditional Japanese ghost stories. And the J-horror filmmakers, that circle that Lindsay was talking about, really admire his work. I think Kurosawa Kiyoshi once made a joke that he doesn't show any Nakagawa films to people because they would know where he stole all of his ideas from. So the iconography of the Onryo that ultimately derives from Yotsuya Kaidan is really for the J-horror filmmakers filtered through that period of Japanese cinema history in the late 1950s, early 1960s, which was bringing those kabuki tales to life in the movie theaters.
Great, thank you. Let me build on also on this. Another question that came up actually earlier from one of the registrants was to ask about a question about the soundscapes of horror and how the sounds of, well, I'll just read the question. The soundscapes of horror and related genres have garnered a good amount of scholarly attention. What about the musical styles or effects used in Japanese horror have you found to be particularly effective and perhaps specific to Japanese cinema? And one example, this this questioner gives us is the use of Buddhist chanting as a sonic semiotic of death and funeral rites. So how does sound work?
Sure. Yeah, this is something I've been thinking about a lot lately, particularly in the films of Asato Mari, who's one of the only women who makes Japanese horror films. And I think that one thing when I think about the soundscape of Japanese horror, I definitely think of motifs and repetitions and certain noises that just repeat again and again and have kind of an ominous, feeling to them. And in addition to, I guess, more exotic sounds like Buddhist chanting or, the traditional sounds that might be associated with a temple or shrine, for example, I think that J-horror is perhaps at its most effective when it uses incredibly innocuous sounds and somehow makes them take on an ominous meaning. There's a recent example in the film, The Inerasable or Zane, where the sound is just the sound of a kimono obi sweeping across the floor. And it's just this very simple sound of just but over the course of the film, as it's repeated and we learn more about its origin, it just becomes this really frightening sound that just builds this tension. And I think we can see that in a lot of other J-horror as well. The famous death rattle of Kayako, the main character from The Grudge, which is just this kind of, otherworldly sort of alien sound. And I think really one thing that I always notice in J-horror is there's also a lot of silence. They don't really overdo it on the music a lot, particularly I think the 1990s to the early 2000s films. Of course, there is, the kind of typical screeching violin to indicate that something's scary, but a lot of it is just very careful use of silence and just carefully chosen sounds that pop up at certain times that take on a kind of ominous feeling.
Mike, anything to add to that from your comparison between the Japanese version of Dingu and the American versions? Any sense of the sound in there?
Well, I agree with Lindsay, right? That it's this expertly controlled balance of silence and then the screeching violins, right? Which to me, that's still, I think, one of the most effective things in the film. I've seen the film way too many times now for it to really scare me, but that screeching sound of that I'm not 100% sure how they even made, honestly. It's just so effective. But if they'd been bombarding you with sound the whole time, I think it wouldn't be. So it's that careful balance of knowing when to be silent and when to not.
Right. So one question that I noticed earlier in the chat, I don't that seemed actually while you guys were presenting also really interesting and also interesting from my perspective, thinking about yokai, was the question of male versus female protagonists. And I can say from the yokai perspective that a lot of there are and one of the early yokai scholars did research on this historically and sort of traced when there were more female yokai and male yokai. But a lot of the sort of narratives involving demonic figures, oni, kappa, tengu, are often male in legends and folklore, particularly rural legends and folklore. There are also female yokai of sorts, but they tend, at least in the folklore, to be more of the Onryo type or Yude type. And I'm wondering, in the case of Japanese horror, are there any male protagonists or bad people? And if not, why not? And what is the gender construct going on there?
I'll just very quickly say that there are definitely a couple of male protagonists. I think Kurosawa Kiyoshi in particular has had several films like Cure and Pulse, where you have these male protagonists who are ghostly or vengeful in some way. So they do exist, and particularly in more recent horror films, say of the last 10 years, I've been seeing it more often. But and I think Michael Crandall can speak to this more than I can, but I just feel like in general, the particular folktales and kabuki stories that really inspired a lot of the most famous J-horror just tended to feature female protagonists. And these were the stories that had proven their worth over time, that got retold and remade again and again and again, going all the way back, as I think talked about in the presentations, to the Tale of Genji, where you have, Lady Rokujo. And so this figure of this kind of vengeful woman has been there for a long time, and it has a lot of staying power. And so I think it made sense that it would pop up again in J-horror.
Yeah,
if I can add one really quick point to that, and then go to you, Mike. I think a lot of people have asked me why yokai are so prevalent in Japanese culture. Are there more yokai in Japan than fairies in Great Britain, or scary stories in other cultures? And to my mind, the answer is, of course not. There's not more, but there is a longer history of media in which there's a kind of reverberation and sharing. And that, as I tried to show in my presentation, started really actually a little bit before the Edo period, but really exploded during the Edo period. And I think, Lindsay, your point speaks exactly to that these are echoes and reverberations of things that have been circulating for a long time. So they do reflect older ideas, even as they take on new shapes in the media. I'm sorry to cut you off, Mike. Do you want to add to that? Or?
Fine, yeah. There are, if you look at the old kabuki plays and kaidan from the Edo period, I mean, you do find male yurei and male onryo, but what always struck me is how emasculated they usually are. So a male ghost, a male vengeful ghost usually appears, and he's kind of like, why did you kill me? Like, he's very kind of pathetic. And the female onryo, like Oiwa and then later Sadako onryo, are just kind of full of rage. They're shrieking and howling, and they're just this awesome presence. And I think there's this interesting kind of notion at work maybe where death kind of, for a man, death is emasculating in the traditional Japanese cosmology, that you become less than you were. But for a woman who in the Edo period would be very marginalized and very powerless and not really in control of her fate, death is maybe kind of liberating in that regard. It gives these women who had no power in life the power to take their fate into their hands and, to get the justice that was denied to them. And I think that's more compelling. So it's, I wouldn't say that it's this purely kind of, women are strange and scary. It's, I think there's really interesting gender dynamics at work there.
Well, and I think the point you're getting at is essentially the gender dynamics of the horror film or the kabuki are reflecting social reality that is being essentially critiqued by the expression within the horror film, and I'm thinking, of course, of Yotsuya Kaidan, which is such a key text in this whole conversation, and what that was saying about Oiwa-san's ability to get revenge only after she was released into the power of death, right? With this rage behind her. So I think it's absolutely reflecting, and I think that's something that's really key to all of this. I think we all touched upon this to a certain extent, is that whatever the story is, it's always reflecting contemporary issues, right? And contemporary modes of expression. So with that, let me ask another question. It sort of gets to what Lindsay's talk was about, but can you talk about the relationship between the supernatural, between the ghostly, between the horrible, the horrorness, and technology?
Yeah, I think that this question of whether media are haunted is a very old one. Ever since we first started playing around with radios and televisions, there has been this idea of whether media can be ghostly, or whether they steal our souls or things like that. And so I think it was natural to see horror films taking this on. And this, of course, was not unique to Japan, from Videodrome to Poltergeist to, all of these films that looked at things like telephones or VCRs and just kind of imagined them as being very susceptible to haunting. And so for me, what's really fascinating with J-horror is just to look at how the evolution of J-horror kind of mirrors the evolution of our relationship to technology and what we find fearful, what we find quaint. So I think that if you look at the first Ring film, you see that television is still something that holds a lot of power over us, and that's kind of scary. But then as time goes on, TV and VCRs become kind of quaint and don't seem to be threatening anymore. But the internet, on the other hand, that's dangerous. So that's kind of our new, bugbear, whatever the thing that's so frightening to us. So I think that in the sense that J-horror is continuously fascinated with technology and connects it to ghosts and haunting. I think that's just part of the long tradition in horror as a whole of being really both drawn to and terrified by new forms of technology.
Right, so there's always a sense that the thing that's new and is slightly unknown is what's going to be the thing that causes us trouble, right? And in this case, it's a kind of supernatural haunting trouble.
I think also this inherent kind of distrust of new technology, right? It's supposed to make our lives better, but does it really? Are there hidden side effects? So I think new technologies really lends itself to the horror genre in that way. It's also something that I think made J-horror travel so well internationally, right? Because it's something that all cultures have to deal with.
Right. I think that makes a lot of sense. And so much of the technology is something that, just like the yokai of the past, were things that happened that we could not explain, we could not understand. So one of the referential ecologies that we rely on is the notion of a haunting, rather than, oh, there's an electrode moving this. I can't even explain it, but right, that's what's happening. Before we go to questions, just one more quick question. This came earlier amongst one of the registrants. Can you guys recommend, for anybody interested in getting more deeply into this, some books? Obviously, I would recommend Lindsay's book and Mike's book. But anything else you can recommend in terms of scholarly works, but also to read more of these stories and read horror tales and whatnot?
Yeah, I would also strongly, sorry, Mike, go ahead, you first.
Yes. Go ahead, Lindsay.
Okay. So yes, Michael Foster's book as well. Definitely both Pandemonium and Parade and his book on yokai. And I think Michael Foster has also introduced a lot of the work of Kazuhiko Komatsu, who some of his books have been translated as well, his books on yokai. I really relied a lot on the work of Gerald Fiegel, who has written a book called Civilization and Monsters, which is a great history of yokai. I think Matt Alt has also done some interesting work on yokai. So those are some of the ones that I would recommend.
Yeah, and I can't remember, maybe it's also Matt Alt, but somebody did a English version of the Toriyama Seki.
That's Matt Alt and Hiroko Yoda. It's a translation. Yeah,
that's what they called it. And there was also a couple years back, I think it was, I can't remember the name of the press. It's a small press, but they did a 3-volume anthology of translations, just called Kaiki, Uncanny Tales from Japan. And it's a really nice cross-section of kind of traditional stories from the Edo period. I think there's some Lafcadio Hearn stories in there, but then also a lot of kind of 20th century short fiction that was done kind of in the spirit of those older Edo tales of yokai. So I would really recommend that 3-volume collection to people as well.
Great. Yeah, it's a Kurodahan press. It's a small press in Fukuoka, and it's a wonderful 3-volume set, like you said, a lot of contemporary stories, but sort of referencing a lot of these older stories. If there are, of course, many, not enough translations of contemporary writers. Kyogoku Natsuhiko, for example, a wonderful writer who is not well enough translated, I think. But I would also recommend it for people interested in looking at some of the older stories, any kind of collection of Setsua. There's a translation of a lot of different stories by Royal Tyler, just called, I think, Japanese Tales. There's a fairly short collection, Burton Watson, called the Demon Aggie Bridge. All of these are great introductions to see how these shape up and see connections between Japanese horror and some of the older stories. And with that, I'm going to hand the reins over to Shun, who has been collecting questions in the chat, I think.
Hi, I'm back. Thank you, Dr. Foster, and all the speakers for the great discussion. It was really interesting to hear it from where I was. And so while I was listening in, I was looking at some of the YouTube questions that we did receive, and I did pick up a couple of interesting ones that we'd like to kind of go over right now. I know we kind of spoke briefly on the gender roles, but kind of go back on that. One of the questions we received was, why is there a trend to depict yokai and ghosts in J-horror as women? Would you like to share your thoughts on that?
I think we covered this already a little bit, just in terms of the history of a lot of folk tales and ghost stories being about women, and therefore, those were the ones that kind of inspired J-horror. The only thing I would add to that, I guess, is that this is interestingly something that I think a lot of non-Japanese audiences really focused on, maybe just because it was a big difference. If you looked at the kinds of horror films that were coming out in the late 1990s and early 2000s in the United States, they tended to be a lot of slasher films and just a lot of films that featured male killers. And that has been, I think, kind of the norm in a lot of English language horror films. So when you had these Japanese horror films that featured women, it was kind of new and different. So that was something that a lot of people noticed.
And I think if you go back, even if you look at kind of the classic monsters from the Western canon, Count Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, the Wolf Man, right? They're all male. If there's a Japanese equivalent of Count Dracula or Frankenstein's monster, it's Oiwa, probably, who is female. So when you look at it from that way, it kind of makes sense that Western Hollywood horror films would kind of have male monsters because there's that tradition that they draw on. And as we said earlier, right, the great kind of classic stories coming from Edo Japan are mostly these female monsters.
Great, thank you. Another question that we got was, and this is going to be more of like an opinion piece, but what do you think is an interesting yokai that is underrepresented in horror?
That's a great question. I would just say that one of the things that I've learned from this conversation and my limited understanding of horror actually is that I think there's a lot of great yokai out there that haven't made it into contemporary or modern horror films or popular culture. Even something like, and I think this goes a little bit to the way in which yokai become, as I think Lindsay used the word, cutified or cutesified, right? So many yokai, even, for example, the kappa, which is a water creature that is found in legends all throughout Japan. And in a lot of those legends, a lot of the way the legends were told at certain points, these kappa were really vicious creatures. They would kill people, they would kill animals, they would drown children. They were really nasty, scary creatures. And yet, as they are told and remediated, and even during the Edo period, they become cuter and less offensive and less troublesome. So now it's hard to imagine. There are a lot of movies about kappa, and particularly anime, but it's hard to imagine one in which they're really scary. So there's a way in which certain yokai lose their ability to cause horror. and I'm not really sure why that is, but again, it has to do with this kind of reverberation within the media, I think. I don't know, Lindsay, Mike, any thoughts on a yokai that would make a great horror film?
I don't know how great it would be, but I'm really partial to the Rokorokubi, which is the geisha girl that can make her neck extend. But the reason I like her is that she doesn't seem to be particularly malevolent, even in the old stories. So whereas Kappa, for example, want to pull you into the water and drown you, the Rokorokubi's goal just seems to be to play a trick on people, which I find charming, frankly.
I was going to suggest the exact same one. I'm partial to the goofy yokai and the ones that just are not scary, but just there's a yokai who walks around carrying a half full bowl of soup on his head. And that's his weirdness or something. It's just that he has soup on his head. So I don't necessarily know what kind of film you would make about the goofier yokai. I do think though that the Gakko no Kaidan series, the school ghost stories series, which was first a book and then became a comic book and now is a series of what I would call kind of kid-friendly horror films. It's a series of films of just, kids ending up in a school and having to deal with a series of yokai with very low levels of intensity, I would say. And the long-necked woman pops up in that one, and a lot of the goofy yokai do as well. So those are a lot of fun.
Great.
Yeah, and I think, well, I'm not a movie maker, but I think that from a filmmaker's perspective, there probably is a lot to be drawn on that hasn't been used as much yet. I mentioned in my talk the Inomononoke Roku, the story of a samurai who is essentially haunted every night by different yokai. And as far as I know, that's never been made into a film, although during the Edo period, it was remediated many different times in different forms of picture scrolls and other stories, and it's been retranslated into modern Japanese numerous times. But I think something like that could be developed into a great modern horror film. So if there's any filmmakers out there, please do it.
Great, thank you for those answers. I'd like to keep going. This is a really interesting one. I like this one. It's just like J-horror has a distinct style in film, how do Japanese horror in books, manga, etc. distinguish themselves from horror in literature and print media from other cultures?
Anybody want to take a try at that? That's a huge question.
I think I will maybe kind of take a roundabout answer to this question and just say that I'm always wary of ascribing any sort of quintessential Japanese-ness to any art form, if only because, as we have discussed, I think Japanese horror, as an example, is very much a hybrid genre. It relies on influences that are really varied. It is, made by filmmakers who were reading French film magazines and watching movies by Peter Weir and Tobe Hooper, and also, were influenced by Japanese folklore. So if we want to say, what is specifically different about Japanese horror than other horror, well, sure, some things are different, but lots of things are also very similar. So I think that when it comes to just J-horror specifically, this very specific group of films released by a particular group of directors over a particular period of time, what distinguished it at that time from horror films in the United States was a lack of violence, a tendency toward female villains, and I think often kind of ambiguous endings. There wasn't really this kind of clear-cut victory over the monster at the end. But again, all of those things are not necessarily quintessentially Japanese things. They are just the features of a particular group of films that happen to hit at a particular moment that kind of distinguished them from other films at the time.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, there was a sense, and I'm sure Michael can speak much more about this, but there was a sense for a long time that yokai in particular were something that were too Japanese for people outside of Japan to understand. So one of the most famous long-running manga anime series in Japan is Gegege no Kitaro, which is all about traditional yokai and such. And it wasn't picked up for distribution after the anime manga boom internationally, the way a lot of these other things were. And there was this sense stemming largely from the Japanese side that yokai were too Japanese to really, make it in the West. And so for a long time, there was no official release of Kitaro, even though it's one of the biggest franchises in Japan. I'm glad to say the most recent series did show up on Crunchyroll. So.
Yeah, and I think these are all great points. And Mike, your point about Gegege no Kitaro, which is by Mizuki Shigeru, who's in Japan, literally a household name. Every person I've ever met who grew up in Japan, who's over the age of 12, knows who Mizuki Shigeru is. But in the US, when I first started teaching Japanese folklore in the US to college students, until about 5 years ago, nobody had ever heard of Mizuki Shigeru. And in part, it has to do with people deciding that his books are not translatable because there's too much baggage associated with them for a non-Japanese audience. But as you point out, Mike, I think that's kind of a false consciousness about people's understandings. And in fact, in the case of Mizuki, I think it was a lot of his descendants, as it were, the people who learned from his work who were published first. Narrating no Mago, for example, I think Nura, Rise of the Yokai Clan in English translation. Those books were published first, and then people took an interest in the earlier, the sort of grandfather of those manga artists. So there's, again, it has a lot to do with the actual media forum and less to do with an essential Japanese-ness of the quality of the presentation or of the creature themselves, I think.
Great, wonderful. Yeah, I think this is gonna have to be our last question. And I don't know how many of you are video game enthusiasts, so I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer this, but there seems to be a wave of recent video games of various genres and styles dealing directly with yokai. Are there any recent studies between this and overlap with other media forms dealing with yokai?
What was the last part of that? Any studies of?
Yes, so any studies between this and other overlapping with other media formats dealing with yokai?
I don't know of any. I do think people are starting to do research on yokai in video games, and I would say one of the reasons they're starting to appear more and more is, yokai have really, there's, in the sort of history of yokai studies, it's often said there's a yokai boom starting in the late 80s for various reasons, people doing research on yokai being presented in various circumstances. But that boom has never ended. It's just getting bigger and bigger. And I think that with the advent of Yokai Watch, the game about 5 or 6 years ago, and its translation into non-Japanese languages, I think that brought the word yokai into sort of a sort of global vision. And all of that has built into them being used in video games in Japan and outside of Japan and transnationally, of course. I don't know of any studies offhand on those issues, but there will be soon, I'm sure. I don't know, Mike, Lindsay, you might know of something that I'm not aware of.
I have lots of students who want to write papers about that exact topic. So I'm sure that some of them will go on to get advanced degrees and turn that into a dissertation or a book. But I think it's still, as you were saying, it's still kind of the new thing. But I think it was a common theme in all three of our talks that yokai and monsters, they're amorphous and they just permeate media. And Sadako, on a very kind of meta level, was about infiltrating different forms of media. So it's just natural, I think, that yokai would end up in video games. And of course, I mean, Pokemon, right? Kind of the mother of a lot of that. And lots of people, including you, Michael, have pointed out that Pokemon kind of mirrors the Edo period obsession with collecting yokai cards and such. So, yeah, I think it was the inevitable evolution, and certainly people will be writing things about it.
And just one, I think one of the, from the perspective of somebody who studies folklore, one of the things that's wonderful about folklore is the variety and the way in which yokai and narratives change over time and circumstances. And one of the ways in which yokai and yurei and onryo and horror stories in general are changing is based on the medium itself, right? So the stories that are told about a yokai within a video game setting are going to be different from ones told on the kabuki stage, and yet they're still going to be associated with that. So there's a wonderful sort of way to watch the transmutation, the metamorphosis of these figures that we know sort of as they move on into the next technology and the next generation of scholars doing research on this, which will be in a few years, hopefully.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for answering those questions. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for today, but I'd like to give a big thank you to our special guest speakers, Dr. Foster, Dr. Crandall, and Dr. Nelson for their time and sharing their expertise with us. Please help us out by filling out a quick survey from the link in the description below and tell us what topics you're interested in for future episodes. And as always, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and newsletter if you haven't done so already. Finally, thank you again for joining us this morning, and we look forward to having you at our next session. Take care. Bye now.
Thank you.
Bye.